It's me again. I'm still wearing the same shirt. Thank you so much for joining me here today. In this series of tutorials, we're gonna recreate a shot I did for a recent project and take that right from concept all the way through to final compositing. So you'll have a complete shot and the entire workflow and pipeline in between. I also have a Patreon page, and this is where I'm gonna plug that. There you'll have access to this entire series end to end when the final episode is released. You'll also be able to download free Cinema 4D project files and After Effects project files if you'd like to follow along and try this out. All for the low, low price of
a cup of coffee.
And if you haven't already, be sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, all that bull, because you wanna be ready and here when the next video in the series is. What's going on, everybody? I just wanted to put a quick note on this tutorial because I'm a humble man, and I just want to let you all know that this tutorial is kind of a rambling mess. So the overall idea of this series is to cover everything from concepting all the way through to the final compositing of a shot. With this tutorial in particular in this series, I was not quite prepared on how to demonstrate how I set up my texturing accurately. To be completely honest, I used a texture from a pre-purchased pack. Say that 3 times fast. Because of the rights on that texture, I can't provide that with any project files, and I also didn't really reverse engineer how to build it. So you'll see me kind of stumbling through how to make the texture. Feel free to skip on through to whatever you do or do not want to watch on this. I totally understand. I just wanted to let you guys know that I promised to kind of address this a little more in depth the next go around into the next series, where I'll spend an entire episode just on how to create the particular texture that I'll be using for that project. So if you stay with me, I'm sure that one day you'll be rewarded. In the meantime, there are some very useful tips in this tutorial as far as rendering goes, how to set up different multipass settings in Octane. This in particular will bring us into the next phase, which is compositing in After Effects. You'll see that next week. Anyway, so I know I'm really going on too long here. I just wanted to let you guys know about that. Thanks for watching, and apologize for all the stumbling and bumbling. Finally, the last thing I do want to note is I want to make a special shout out to all of my Patreons. You will see their names on the screen right now. That's right, it's currently just Dan. Dan is always going to have a special place in my heart because he was my first and only patron ever. But you can join Dan, and you're definitely going to get something for your money. So for the price of $2 a month, it's just this thank you section. You'll be in all my videos, just like Dan. You'll be right next to Dan, getting a thank you shout out in my videos. For $5 a month, you'll get access to my project files. These are for educational use only, but you'll be able to break down and see exactly what's going on in there. For example, with this series, Dan was able to get the X particle files, everything from the MoGraph effectors on up, the models for the chain, everything. You could use anything in there, however you'd like, for educational purposes. Basically, I really don't care what you do with this stuff, just as long as you don't take the shot exactly as it is and use it to make a bunch of money, unless you want to give me that money too, or just a cut of it, that'd be cool. Anyway, finally, there's 2 more tiers. I'm rambling. For $8 a month, we're going to do an AMA, Ask Me Anything podcast monthly once we fill up that tier, once we get some people on that tier. There you'll be able to submit questions, and we'll do basically like a live Q&A that we'll record and share for patrons. And for $15 a month, you could dive deeper. It's the Dive Deeper tier. And the perks in that tier, we have a monthly Google Hangout where you can, again, ask me any questions. You could show me your work. We could share screens. We could do anything we really want for the entirety of the Google Hangouts call. That's an hour plus. On the Hangouts call, we could just talk about anything, motion design. We talk about the coronavirus. We can talk about anything. You know, there's a bunch of options there. I'm rambling. This is stupid. Skip to the tutorial to the parts you want. Go back, look at some old stuff, and look forward to some new stuff. I love you guys. Thanks so much for watching. And here I'm going to go ramble for a while. So in this episode, we're gonna pick up where we left off with Jeremy. All right, so we'll get started. And what I like to use is Octane. If you've been following any of my videos before, you've seen that I use Octane, and this video is no different. So I'm gonna just open up my live viewer here. And the materials here are very, very simple that we're going for. So right off the bat, what I'm gonna do is go into my Octane settings, go into my settings, environment, and just turn my default environment to pure black because I want to do very minimal additive lights. I'm going to switch off these objects here in my setup just to make sure that only this chain is showing up in my render here. So I'm going to go up, and the first thing I'm going to do is grab an Octane area light, and it's probably going to be overkill, but already look at that. You can see all those dust particles showing up. And when I'm doing lighting, I like to jump out into my different views here, and I want a nice soft overhead light, almost like a China ball. So I'm not worried about the rotation of this yet, but I'm just gonna bring that up out of the shot. I'm gonna go to my Octane light. Right in my details tab, I'm gonna go to area shape and change this to a sphere. And boom, there we go. Beautiful lighting right off the bat. What I'm gonna do is kind of plan this on my final shot. So I'll skip this to the end frame. Look at that, absolutely gorgeous. So right now we're getting this starry kind of feel, like a star field, which is not what I want to go for. So let's play around with our Octane light. What I like to do is go into the distribution tab, and if I go to the drop down here, go to plugins, C4D Octane, and go to a fall off map. What that's going to do is give me a much more natural fall off on the light. If I jump out of my view here, go to favorite frame default, I can see this is what the light looks like. It puts this gradient on the light, and it gives it, like I said, a much more natural fall off. So the light already starts to look a little bit more realistic. You could see down in the chain right here, if I kill that by clearing it, you see we're getting just absolutely blasted with light right there. Let's undo that, put that back in. Okay, so we'll start there on our lighting. But let's start to, I kind of bounce back and forth between lighting and texturing to see where we ultimately want to wind up. So for my texture, we'll start with the dust because that's going to be a very, very simple setup. The dust, what I like to do for dust is just use an Octane glossy material. We'll call this dust. And with the dust material, I'm just going to go into my generators. I'm going to add dust to both. And in my material editor, I'm gonna open up my node editor. And I'm fine with the white. This is, like I said, this is super simple. I want it to be very reflective because I want it to pick up the light. But all I'm gonna do is go into opacity. I'm gonna put a float texture, plug it right into opacity so I have a slider to control this. I'm gonna set this to about 70. And that's going to give me a little bit of an opaque element to that texture. And that's it. What I like about that is it will, like I said, it'll still be reflective, and that'll give me that kind of speckling that I want as those move around. And I could just simply shift this around if they're appearing too much or too little. And we'll start to see how much those appear when we dial in the actual camera settings. So after this, what we'll do is our chain. I'm going to start with another Octane glossy material. We'll call this chain. And you guessed it, we'll apply this material to our chain.
Ooh, that's a bingo!
So I'm going to drop it right on the cloner. And for starters, if I went into diffuse to make sure it's affecting the cloner and change that color, beautiful, beautiful red chain. But what I like to do, rather than like playing around with these defaults in there, I like to plug things into the nodes. I find it a little bit easier to control. Let me send this back to render again, just to kind of clean that up. Okay, and what I want to do is grab an RGB spectrum, and we'll put that into the diffuse node. And I want this to be, a gray kind of color. Also, what I'll do is grab another float texture, which the float is it just acts as a 0 to 100 scale basically, because it's applying a 0 being, I believe, white and 100 being black. I might have that backwards, but we're gonna apply that to the roughness. So we have a roughness slider. What I'm gonna do is go into the index of this, which is right here. And if I crank the index down, if I go to 1, it's gonna give me a perfectly shiny sphere. If I don't have anything on the roughness, I'm just gonna get this perfectly reflective, like chrome sphere. And what I could do is control my color of my material itself, but what you see is I get this metallic sphere. So at 1.3, that's our default. And what this is the index of refraction. So it's going to determine how the light is interacting with our object, or something physically based like that.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
What I like to do is if I have a very specific material I'm dialing in and I'm not using like a material pack, with Final Shot I actually used Grayscale Gorilla's everyday material pack. But what you could do is go on index of refraction, which is pixelandpoly.com, and you could see what different materials, how they refract light. So we're using a chain here, so we're gonna look for a steel chain. Jump down to the S's and we'll see if there is steel here. I'm sure there is. So steel has an index of refraction of 2.5. So all we need to do then is go back into our chain material, go to our index and type in 2.5, and now we have the correct refraction of how our chain would react. The other thing we're going to do is add our float texture back into the roughness, and then you're starting to get a sense of how that steel is built. I can increase or decrease the shader, or the float shader, to get it to be more or less reflective. But what I like to do is, instead of using a float texture here, I'll grab an image texture. And in the image texture, I'll jump into some dirt masks that I purchased from 3D Collective. And what these do is give you a really nice noise pattern. I could drop that in there instead. And if I get really close to my chains, I can start to see how that's affecting them. So I could get into UV, dealing with the UV properties of this, but since they're going to be so far away, I'm not too terribly concerned about it. But what I like to do is throw an image texture in there and start to tinker around with different settings we have. So if you right click on this and you go to solo node, it's going to show you, it's going to solo whatever node that you selected. In this case, I'm soloing this image texture, and I'm seeing how this image texture is affecting the material, or the geometry that's laid on. So if I go into that and I go to UV transform, I can start to play around with the transformation. Let's try this at like 0.5. All right, cool. Already we're starting to see that material. We're starting to see that dirt. Now it is wrapping in an undesirable way on this link right here. You can see where we're getting that hard edge. Like I said, for this type of use case, I'm not terribly worried about the seams duplicating, because as soon as we disable that solo node, you start to look at the lighting, and then we look at where our camera is, you're not going to see that. So that's also a limitation of my abilities to properly UV and texture. So you got to know where your limitations are and kind of work with them from there. So let's play around with the color of our chain. I think we want it to be a little, we about had it where we wanted it. There we have different patches of roughness on different areas of the chain. And again, if I play around with this, solo this node, play around with the scaling, and what I could do is play with the gamma of this, and the lower I put that gamma, if I put that at 0, it's gonna make our image texture, like, it's bring it closer to white, so we're not getting any of that. It's actually roughing up the entire link, because the roughness we're saying is all the way at white. The black, all the way at black, is where it would be shiny. So if we went to like something like 8, you're seeing a ton of shine there, but we're still getting the We're still getting the diffusion on there. So at a default of 2.2, what we're seeing is the areas of darkness are going to be shinier, and the areas of lightness are going to be rougher. But the other thing we could do is we could grab a gradient node and drop that in line here. And instead of going to absolute black and absolute white, we could change these values. And we could start to swing that scale around in a way that changes the level of roughness. Because I think what we want is an overall pretty shiny chain link. So we would want this pretty dark so that it's staying pretty shiny overall.
You will ride eternal, shiny and chrome.
So here we have our basic chain texture. Just for the purposes of this this tutorial. We get further into texturing in another tutorial, but there you go. It's we have our basic texturing, and finally the last thing we want to do is just kind of tweak our camera. So for starters, what we'll do is go into our attributes, and I want to take off autofocus, and obviously we're going to want a nice depth of field. I try to treat these cameras realistically, so I don't want to go crazy with the f-stop, but I do have a 0.95 camera lens in real life, and I love how crazy out of focus you could get it. So if we go to pick focus, and we pick focus right on our link there, we're starting to see that nice out of focus. Our chain is out of focus as it's closer to the camera, but we're focusing right on that. And now from here, this is where I'll start to tweak my aperture and really kind of blow this out of focus a lot more. If I put my aperture up to 5 centimeters, you're going to really start to see it go out of focus. That's a 0.5, so it's not, there might be a lens that opens up that wide, I'm just not sure. But that's what we're doing for this. But what's nice is all this dust particulate is starting to go out of focus. The other thing that I like to do is change my aperture aspect ratio to 3 and the aperture edge to 2. And what this does is gives it more of an anamorphic look. You could see the pixels, the bokeh on the pixels of the out of focus dust particles here are starting to look a little bit more anamorphic. Now we can bring that aperture down a lot more. And we're basically there. I think the last thing that I would want to do is animate my focal depth. So here we're at the final frame. Set that focal depth there. And my starting frame, I want my focal depth to be here. I'm gonna set that. And this is because I just want to chase the chain with my focal plane, so that for the most part it is staying within focus and leading the eye where I want it to go as this chain moves through the scene. So finally, the last thing I would do is set this up for my rendering passes. So I'm going to go into my render settings. Normally I would use path trace lighting because I feel like the image comes out a lot more realistic. And by default, let's go to our renderer, Octane Render. And by default, our render settings are super high. So 16,000 samples, diffuse depth, and specular depth at 16 apiece. You can see this one frame is rendering at 5 minutes and 22 seconds. We're not going to need to do that. So what I want to do is bring this down to anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 samples. I like to bring my diffuse depth down to 6, my specular depth to 8, and I change my GI clamp to 5. There are a lot of resources out there that help you to set up render settings. This is just the general starting point that I go off of. I also like to turn on adaptive sampling. That way, as different areas of the scene start to render, the processing power will work on other areas of the scene to render that a little bit quicker. Finally, what I like to do is set up my more advanced render settings. So what I'll do is go to Octane Renderer. In my main, I want to check on Use Denoise Beauty Paths because I want to save that. I also, on this machine, I only have one GPU. You can see it right there. But I like to click on Use All GPUs in case you bring the scene over to another machine that has multiple GPUs. What I'll do now is go to Render Passes and enable these. And let's start to plan our outputs. I like to use EXR files because we can save everything in one pass. So we're going to change that to OpenEXR. And we are going to take a look at our scene again. If we go to our first frame, there's no particles here. They actually don't start until frame 1. That's how we kind of had everything set up earlier. So I want to render from frame 1. So I'm going to go to output. I'm going to start from frame 1 and render to frame 90. So we have particles in every shot of the scene. I have my width and height of my scene set up. This is in Panavision aspect ratio, so it's a more filmic look. I'm rendering this out at 30 frames per second, but I'll actually interpolate that in After Effects to 24. So if I go back into my save, everything's there. I'm going to leave this blank, but this is where you would put your file path where you want to save that. In Octane Render, I've enabled my render passes. I'm going to put that same file path in here. So we're enabled here. I have this file. What I'll do is I'll put the file path here. I'm going to change my depth to 32-bit depth so I have a lot of color control later. I'm in EXR file format. And with my image color profile and tone map type, I'm going to change that tone map type to tone mapped. This is to properly set up our Z depth pass, which is our main pass, some of our main passes that we want in this render setup. So for setting up the render passes, what I want my denoised beauty pass. These are my denoiser passes. In my beauty passes, I'll take the diffuse pass. I might play around with that. I definitely am going to want my different lighting passes. With my Octane light, what I could do is I can actually go into my Octane light tag and define this light pass ID as a specific light ID. I'm going to call it light pass ID 3 because that'll help us in compositing, making this one-to-one in this tutorial. But you can label that whatever you want, up to 8. And what I'm going to do in my lighting passes is I'm going to turn on light pass 3. So what that'll do is render out a separate pass that's just that lighting. What that'll do is we're actually going to supplement that lighting in comp. So that's why that is there. And then info passes, the main thing I really want for this tutorial is the Z depth pass, and that's going to give us our black to white values of distance from foreground to background. So what I'll have to do is go into my Z depth max and kind of adjust that slider until I start to see my chain appear. And if I click this to the final frame and go back to those render settings and adjust that slider, this will start to assist in giving me depth on the chain, and it's going to be very minimal because the spiral is pretty close, but if at around like 8 there, we could start to see this part of the chain falls off into nothing, and this chain part is still has some dark value to it. Probably get it around 8.5. and you'll see how that works in a minute. So I have all my different passes. My main and my noise are looking the same, and I want to make sure my beauty pass is checked on, so save beauty pass. And if I go into Octane Render and I go to denoiser, I click enable denoising. Now I will have my main pass and my denoised main pass, which will, I think, do a post-processing denoise on the image at the end of it. Then once I have all this set up, I'm just going to save one more time. And I'm going to, in this case, send it to the picture viewer, and it's going to start to render. And then we're ready for compositing. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please do comment down below. I read the comments all the time and they do influence the content that I'm putting out for you guys, and I love the feedback. Also, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. That's at JRMY_Walker, JRMY_WLKR. You could also reach me via email at jeremy@jeremywalker.com. That's JRMY@JRMYWLKR.com. And once again, please subscribe, ring the bell, all that kind of stuff so that you can be a part of the next episode in the series when it is released. Thanks again so much, guys. Take care.